Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, what if the future isn't something we discover, but something we're being quietly steered towards? For thousands of years, humans have turned to prophets, oracles and seers to help make sense of uncertainty. From reading the stars to interpreting animal entrails, we've always looked as a species for someone, frankly anyone, to tell us what's going to happen next. And that instinct hasn't gone away. But we're at risk, as my guest on today's show explains, of replacing the oracle with the algorithm. That guest is Dr Carissa Véliz, a philosopher at Oxford University and the author of a fascinating new book about prophecy, prediction and power. And in it, Carissa makes a compelling and frankly unsettling argument that today's predictive technologies aren't just helping us to understand and manage the future, they're actually shaping it. In our conversation, we explore why rulers have always kept prophets close, how prediction has historically been a tool of power, and why our modern obsession with data, AI and certainty might be leading us into very dangerous territory. We talk about everything from ancient astrologers managing the risk of being thrown off cliffs, to why publishing, insurance and even coffee shops reveal the hidden mechanics of prediction today. And perhaps most importantly, we ask, in a world that promises ever more accurate forecasts, what does it actually mean to remain human? I really enjoyed this conversation. I think you will too. It's my discussion with Dr. Carissa Véliz on prophecy. Carissa, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Christian.
I am super excited. You have written this amazing book, which is all about prophecy, prediction, that kind of thing. How does someone studying what you study, researching what you research, come to look at that as a lens through which to look at the world?
I think of my job as recognizing the elements that are important in our society and that other people might be missing. So I look out for angles that might be very important to tackle, but that somehow fall in between the cracks, or something like the water we swim in that is so pervasive that we end up not seeing what's around us.
And so you've taken a look at the risks posed by AI in particular, but I guess tech in general. But to do that, you go back. And so when I first opened the book, it's clear from the subtitle on the cover, but obviously I just dived straight in. But you decided rather than looking at the risks posed today, you take us right back to the significance of prediction as part of, I guess, the human condition. What was it that made you decide to go back to look at this subject?
A few things. One is just pure curiosity of where does this come from and for how long have we been using prediction and how? Another element is, of course, that I'm a philosopher, and being a philosopher, I tend to gravitate towards ancient Greece. When I tackle a new problem, when I always think, well, what would have Plato said about this and how they said something important about this? But even more importantly than those two elements is that today, the public sphere is so muddled by so many elements between geopolitics and technology and very big personalities and disinformation and misinformation. And it's very hard to know what's what. And when you look at the past, there is a kind of distance that allows for a greater understanding. And when it comes in particular to prediction, when you look at the ways in which we have used prediction, because we don't believe in those methods anymore, animal entrails, reading animal entrails or reading tea leaves or trying to read the stars are not the most preferred methods of prediction today, then everything else becomes more salient and obvious and apparent. And the power plays that were used behind the methods are much more enlightening for someone today. And that tells us something that might clear some of the muddle that we're facing today.
And you told a number of stories. I mean, the book is full of stories about you, and I want to come and talk about those, but also just sort of things I'd heard of before, but you shed in a new light, but stuff I hadn't. And one of the bits that really fascinated me was you talk a lot about prophets. And in the past, rulers often wanted to have somebody that would help them navigate the future. And there are some lovely stories in there about prophets who have got a brilliant ability to sort of manage the risk that if they get something wrong, they're going to be killed. Tell us a little, give us a couple of those great examples, because I thought that was just a lovely way into the topic.
As soon as you start researching prophecy, you realize that everywhere where there is an important leader, somebody making decisions about a country or a war, they tend to have a prophet by their side. Sometimes it's an oracle, sometimes it's a seer, it's an astrologer. And of course, it's a privilege to be that person and whisper in the ear of a leader who's going to change the world. But it's also risky because kings and other despots tend to be pretty whimsical creatures, and they have a lot of power. And if you make a prediction that they don't like, well, it's a risky business. There are many great stories, but there's a story about how there was a tyrant in the ancient world that was on the lookout for the perfect astrologer. And he had a habit of throwing astrologers off cliff if he didn't like their responses. And so he interviews the latest astrologer and asks him, if you're so good at what you do, tell me about your fate. And then the astrologer looks to the sky and says, I'm in grave danger. And who knows whether the astrologer had heard about what this guy used to do before, or whether he read his body language or whatever else. But the tyrant was so impressed that he became the court astrologer for many years to come.
And then there's this follow-up story that you reference as well, where it was sort of like, well, you know, what's your fate going to be? And the prophet basically says, I'm going to die 3 days before you do, which was a brilliant. You reference as a brilliant piece of risk management of understanding the dynamics that are there. And I was kind of reflecting back on the role way back when, as opposed to now. In simple terms, they're kind of making it up, right? They haven't got any great superpowers. And you've got these people, I guess nowadays we might put them in the bucket of charlatans who are sort of making things up. But that trend of people pretending they can predict things has continued nowadays. So there's something in the human psyche about a desire to have people predict the future, and also people who are willing to fulfill that role without necessarily having the basis. So we can think about astrology. And I thought that was something that came through, was this desire for certainty that we have, and we will turn to unlikely sources to find that.
Yes, I think being a human being is a very stressful experience. We're smart enough to know that a lot can go wrong and that a lot will go wrong. And that anxiety about the future pushes us to ask experts to tell us what the future is and to tell us essentially what to do. In a public sphere in which there are battles for power, there will always be someone who figures, you want me to tell you what to do? Yeah, okay, sure, I'll tell you what to do. And of course, they will usually give advice that is in their best interest and not necessarily in your best interest. And this illusion that anyone can know what the future holds. So, for example, I've been working on privacy for years, and almost every time that I talk with a journalist, the last question will be, and tell us what is the future of privacy? As if, because I know about the present of privacy, I will have more of a glimpse than anyone else about the future of privacy. And especially since something like the future of privacy depends on us and citizens. So I often answer, you tell me, are you going to download Signal? Are you going to protect your privacy? And what is interesting is that we tend to associate predictions with knowledge, and especially in an environment in which risk assessment and risk management has become so much part of the ordinary language, of course, in business and in government, but even for ordinary citizens. When in fact, when you actually look at how predictions are made, how they are used, they're very often in the realm of power. So for example, when you take a tech executive, I think there are many things we confuse. We confuse someone being wealthy with having more authority or more knowledge, when that's not necessarily the case. There are many ways to become wealthy, and not all of them signal any kind of wisdom. Sometimes you might be a genius in one very slim aspect of life and a disaster in many others. But more importantly, I think we tend to think like, well, if this person is designing the cutting edge technology, surely they must know more than others. Instead of realizing that when a tech executive is painting a picture of the future, what they're doing is marketing. They're trying to sell you their product. And what I find very concerning is when governments turn to these people for advice as experts, instead of realizing, well, these are businessmen who are doing marketing.
The more I sort of dove into the subject and reading the book, the more terrified I became, because I started to sort of look around. There's a reliance on tech bros in most cases for their expertise. But I was just sort of looking around and going, we have turned to people, to your point, who are eminently unqualified. And whether that's inviting celebrities onto TV shows to opine on politics, or even politicians, the bar is very, very low. And that kind of astonished me, because as I was reading, I sort of thought, well, we ought to have learned by now. And I can see how, people some time ago were bamboozled by things. But I sort of approached this topic and go, we're reasonably sophisticated people. We understand this stuff. We're savvy. And yeah, as the tech example, but loads of others point out, we seem to be quite, I don't want to say dumb, but we seem to be missing a trick here.
Yes. I think it's a combination of many things. One thing is the emotional side of it. We want to have certainty. We want to feel safe. We want the world to be a certain way. We want to have the illusion that somebody knows, because we certainly don't know, but surely there's a grown-up somewhere who is driving the bus. But it's also, for me certainly, and I think for most people, a kind of overwhelm. We get so much information all the time. Much of it is noise, it's not signal. And it's really hard to keep track of what's what and to figure out where is this going. And even just an assessment of the present is quite complicated because we are bombarded with so much content.
And talk to us a little bit about the link. I mean, we've referenced monarchs, typically kings, but obviously they're queens as well, and leaders using prophets to kind of help it. But you make the link in the book between power and prediction. It was one of those lovely things. So often in the book, I was like, oh, that's really obvious with hindsight. Can you just explain that link to people? Because it is, as I say, blindingly obvious once it's been pointed out to you.
From a sociological perspective, it's just, as you say, obvious that there's always this prophet next to the leader. And they play many roles. Often it's a role of legitimizing power. If you think about how we founded many of the cities around the world, there's usually a prophecy that we should have founded that city there for whatever reason. And so often that prophecy is after the fact to justify a decision. But it also justifies a particular person. And whereas in democracy, we can justify someone being in power because people voted for them, in the context of other systems of government, you have to justify why that person is leading us. And often it was done through some kind of divination of sorts. So that was the case with Augustus, who was a perfect nobody in the Roman world. But when he had already achieved greatness or was very close to it, a prophecy arises that he's going to be emperor, and it justifies his power. But it's a very scary thing to be the leader of a country. And in particular, if you're a tyrant, because to get there, you've had to done some very nasty things to a lot of people who are not happy about it. And whereas you get to enjoy the view from above, there are a lot of people vying for your power. And the uncertainty of it and the knowledge that any decision could be your last or could bring your downfall creates the same anxiety that we all feel and the search for answers. So one of the examples I give is that the Dalai Lama, the leader of the Tibetan people, uses an oracle. And in this crucial moment in which he has to flee Tibet, it's the oracle that tells him when and how and to go. And it's easy to judge someone from the comfort of your couch reading a book. But if you're a terrified 24-year-old with troops coming your way, I wouldn't blame him.
The bit I thought was fascinating was we can see those links you're talking about. If I looked at North Korea, be a really good example, right? So there's the narrative that they put out there as to why the family is in charge. But you've also got this desire to know what the hell's going on, right? To spy on everybody, to keep close control of your population. So all of this stuff sort of logically fits together. And when we look at an example like that, that's kind of what bridges the gap, I guess, between history and what you were talking about in terms of what the technology is doing nowadays.
And that makes a huge difference, because even though you might say, well, okay, part of what the point is of the book is that we've seen this before. We shouldn't be so dazzled. We shouldn't be so surprised. We can learn about the past. We have used predictions in these ways. The technology does make a difference because it scales very much, because no other technology has been so good at surveilling. So if you were the Oracle of Delphi, you had a lot of power when it came to making a prediction, but you had relatively little information to go on. You could hire spies and learn more about the people asking for your advice, but it was really limited. You weren't collecting their data, thousands of data points 24/7 and analyzing them with an AI. And my first book, Privacy is Power, was about the machinery of surveillance. Exactly what personal data are we collecting? Why are we collecting it? How do we analyze it? Who do we send it to? And this book is about the machinery of prediction that is at the service of that machinery of surveillance. We only surveil in order to try to predict what people will do and influence it. And that last part is very important because you wouldn't care about either surveilling or predicting if you didn't want to influence people. And one of the most dangerous aspects about social predictions about anything having to do with the social world, is that it influences the reality that it's purporting to predict. So it's not about just figuring out what the future looks like. It's actually about controlling it. It's about molding it, shaping it. So every time you make a prediction about a person and you act in accordance with that prediction, you exercise a kind of force that acts almost like a magnet that bends reality towards the prediction itself.
And you used what I thought was given it's a book, I thought there's a very brave example you used throughout the book, which is to talk about the publishing industry and to sort of unpick how they deal with that. Do you want to just talk a little bit about, because there's the phrase self-fulfilling prophecy, and you use the book industry to brilliantly illustrate that. And I just love the fact that you've done it in a book, which I thought was a beautifully sort of punfully intended meta moment. Can you just talk a little bit about how that works? Because I think that's a really good illustration, because I think it's a good example of industrialization of some of the principles that you've referred to.
Obviously, I love books. I'm a writer, and in my view, books are the best part of life. And since the reader is also reading a book, I imagine that they're interested in books as well. And books are interesting for many reasons, because I think they're still the best method that we have of conveying sophisticated, complex, long arguments from one person to another, because historically they've been very important in that conveying of knowledge, not only knowledge, but also wisdom. And they have acted many times as a kind of counterweight to these prophets, these charlatans. But at the same time, books are part of an industry, they're a business. And like any other business, they are vulnerable to the forces of prediction. So when you're an author and you want to write a nonfiction book, you write a book proposal and you try to find an agent who is excited about it, and the agent finds an editor. And the editor will offer an advance for that book proposal. And as an author, you want the largest advance you can possibly get. And it's not only about money. Of course it's about money, but it's not only about money, because the advance signals interest from the editor. Essentially, it's a bet. The editor is saying, I really like this book and I think it's going to do well. And the more the editor is willing to pay for that book, the more they will be willing to promote the book, to put marketing and publicity in it, and then the better chances the book has of succeeding. So not too long ago, there was a very big lawsuit about big publishing houses merging or not. And in that lawsuit, some interesting numbers came out. And there was because like most industries, we don't know a lot about exactly what goes on. And most books sell very few books. But there are very few books that sell a lot of books. And usually these very few books are books for which the publisher paid a huge amount of money. And now usually there's a correlation that makes sense. So if you're a superstar personality, say if you're Barack Obama, a publisher will be willing to pay millions for your book because you have so many millions of followers and so many people interested in your book that it's bound to be a success. Even if you write a pretty bad book, there's probably enough people interested in you as a personality that it will succeed. Whereas when you're someone who doesn't have that kind of following, even if you write a brilliant book, it might not take off. And so it's a bigger gambling situation. So if you take it to the extreme, and this is not the reality of the industry, but I write about it as a kind of warning, but also a signaling that we are walking in that direction and that we might not even want to do that. You wouldn't even need to read a book. If you have the data, so if you have the data of how many followers this person has and how many books did they sell in their previous book, it wouldn't matter to read the book. But of course, luckily, editors are interested in literature and they read the book. And the best kind of book is one which surprises, because it's one that the editor doesn't pay a lot for, because it's not one of these almost manufactured blockbusters. And it's a good book that people appreciate for the content and that takes off. Like, for example, I mean, there are many examples, but in one spectacular example from the point of view of sales is Harry Potter. This was somebody who had never published before. Nobody knew her. Tried to publish with many publishers. It didn't work out. And then finally published with quite a small publishing house. And because people loved the book and talked about it, it took off. And part of what we want is to make sure that the industry isn't completely dominated by these self-fulfilling prophecies. We want the really interesting, quirky books to have a chance at getting to us, even though they are unlikely success.
And I love the fact that what you point to is once you put money behind this thing, you kind of need it to succeed because it would be embarrassing. And therefore there's promotion behind it. So the self-fulfilling element is we've paid a big advance for this. We better make sure this is a success. We're going to push it down the channels and promote it. And that's what then crowds out the Harry Potter equivalents that you're talking about.
Yeah, and for the author, there is another loop of self-fulfilling prophecies going on. When you're about to publish a book, pre-orders are incredibly important. In fact, they're more important than orders, because
which is insane, right? Because it's people buying it before they like this. That isn't a validation. That's just going, I think this is going to be good because I've been told it's good.
Yes, but what it does is that publishers interpret it as a signal for interest in readers, and so they are more likely to print more books. And once you have the physical books printed out, you better sell ones.
And I remember when you were writing about it on LinkedIn, you dipped into this and just basically went, this is exactly right. And pre-sales are really important for all the reasons I identify in the book. So I love that self-referential bit of thing. But this is so prevalent. And again, it was, the more I looked at some of the examples you've had, and the other big example that I wasn't expecting to get a history of the insurance industry. And honestly, if you presented me with, here's a history of the insurance industry to read as a Christmas present or something, I might have gone, I'll put that on the I'll read it one day pile. But you got me interested in insurance. And the bit that I thought was, basically the whole point of this was you start off by talking about, here's a legitimate business, right, that works on that actually serves a very important social purpose that's kind of been twisted. And I thought that was another really good illustration of how we sort of, some of these technologies are moving us away from things that might have been legitimate activities in the past into dangerous spaces.
Yeah, the history of insurance is fascinating. And of course, everybody's afraid of bad things happening to us, whether it's health or your house burning down or flooding or something like that. And we all want protection from it. So the history of insurance starts with a very important and very sensible and very also communal worry about how do we protect each other individually, but also as a community against these catastrophic events. And at the beginning, it wasn't even an industry. It was just, how do we pool our resources together such that we know that something bad is going to happen to one of us. And when that happens, we have enough resources to help that person. And because we don't know who is going to be the unlucky one, it makes sense for everybody to chip in to the same degree. And the principle of insurance, therefore, is first solidarity, second, the pooling of risk. And another interesting thing is that it is based completely on forecasting, because it's all about the future. It's the whole reason of being of insurance is that we don't know what's going to happen. And as the industry of forecasting develops and we go from qualitative forecasting to quantitative ones, and we have a better understanding of life expectancy and of different kinds of risks, it becomes more institutionalized as an industry. And it goes from happening in a coffee shop, Lloyd's coffee shop, very informally, to becoming something like what we know today. But when AI comes into the picture, the push is for going from population level statistics saying out of 1,000,000 people, how many will develop diabetes or heart disease or will have a car crash, to is this person going to have a heart attack? This particular person, Christian, of this age, who lives here, eats this, who bought something last week. And when you go from group population predictions to individualized predictions, the whole system changes because suddenly individuals are essentially paying for their own way. So, for example, you might do a genetic test that comes out with something about your genes that doesn't look great, and suddenly your premiums go up. You are not at fault. It's not about you not driving well or not eating well. And yet you are being asked for a higher premium because the insurance company thinks that you are higher risk. But if you're paying for your own way, then why are you using insurance at all? You're just paying a middleman extra money. And the whole reason for being of insurance goes away. And that's not only bad for individuals who will have to deal with a burden that as individuals they will not be able to cope with, but it's very bad for society. And one example is the financial crisis, which essentially was that we pushed risk onto the shoulders of individuals by giving them loans that banks should have known or knew that they couldn't pay. And then eventually individuals break down because the pressure is too much. And when enough individuals face challenges that they can't cope with, society breaks down and suffers as well, because society, shocking news, is made up of individuals.
The insurance example really resonated with me because we know this as we all renew our insurance policies, the number of questions we're being asked increases. So they're kind of gathering data, and that's all entrapment, right? It's kind of like, let's ask loads of questions and then, oh, well, you didn't tell us this. But if you combine that with the data that they're gathering that you point out, from other sources, suddenly this is incredible. Like it's almost like the classic thing here is, what we're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a ton of things going on underneath that. So one of the things that struck me reading the book is it's almost like if we can see it already, there's a load more stuff going on that we can't see.
That's true. That's absolutely true. And in fact, when I've talked with people who work in the industry, that's the sense that they give me. And very importantly, from the point of view of risk, is that on the surface, it might seem that the insurance company is lowering its own risk. But especially with insurance and especially with important things, important kinds of insurance, it's very obvious that the risk to society is increasing. And we're not quantifying that risk. We're not taking it into account. And so we're kind of ignoring it. And we have a huge blind spot that is extremely dangerous, much more dangerous than if we had the other more individualized risks.
As you're talking, and I was going to ask you this at the end, but I want to make sure we capture this. It's really, really important. You're calling something out here that's really significant, right? And what I love about it is you're calling it out on a systemic basis, but you're also calling it out in a way that, and that's why I thought the book was great, is you're calling it out in ways that we can all appreciate, right? You're translating this into something I can make sense of, and insurance would be a really good example of that. It's a risky strategy in a way. I mean, I talked about you sort of challenging the publishing industry, and I know that that's what academics are there to do. But this is not a risk-free thing you're doing here, right? It's exactly what I would hope somebody in your position would do. But I mean, it's quite brave in a way for you to go there.
Yeah, sometimes there's a fine line between stupidity and bravery. I'm sure you find out after the fact which one was it. But it's also about not being a cynic and believing that if I'm willing to tell the truth and tell it like I see it, because I think it's important, because I think it's my job, that there will be other people who will appreciate it and be there for me. Like that there will be an agent who is also brave, and there will be an editor who's also brave, and a publisher that's also brave, and somebody who will invite me to a podcast who's also brave. Because these things, if we don't talk about them, they're just going to explode in our faces sooner or later. That's one thing about truth and reality, that eventually you hit a wall.
Right, and it's sort of interesting, isn't it? Because back to the earlier point around prophecies, you discover whether they turn out to be correct or not. I guess one of the things here, the challenge is that, back to the iceberg analogy, is that lots of these things are happening under the hood. So we kind of have a sense of what's going on. But obviously the nature of this technology means that a lot of this is invisible to us. And therefore that moment of truth maybe comes too late. It's further advanced than we think it is. So in a way, the truth is hidden from us in a way that it might not be if you were looking way back when to predict something.
Yes. And part of the challenge is to take better control of the ship as the citizenry. because in a democracy, we are supposed to be in better control. And a start is to start talking about it, to ask questions about it, to recognize that it's a public debate that we should be having and haven't yet had, to ask questions to business people, to our government officials, to our political representatives, to the opposition, to other citizens, but also be more aware of how much we are complicit in this culture of divination and injustice. And I don't want to blame people, because that's actually not what I mean. One of the most important plays in the playbook of the tyrant is to make the population feel complicit, because once you make the population feel complicit, they will feel so guilty and so part of the system that they won't react against it, that they won't talk, that they will just comply. And so I don't mean to blame people as in, oh, you should have done better. It's more like we have more power than we feel we do, that these systems of self-fulfilling prophecies depend on our believing those predictions, on us wanting to use those predictions, on us going to experts and saying it one more time, please tell me what to do. And that if we change our mindset and if we see predictions for what they are, it's like building up our immune system, both as individuals to lead our own lives, but also as a society and a democratic society.
And of course, what we're up against with that is, I'll put it simply, laziness, right? It's much easier for me to go use Gen AI to get an answer. It's much easier for me to kind of, I won't bother researching, I'll just buy the bestseller. I'll go on Spotify and get recommendations from the algorithm, right? That's an easier path for us.
That's one way to put it. Another way to put it would be that it's a matter of values, and that because the power of prediction isn't very obvious until somebody points it out and then becomes very transparent, then your priorities change. So, for example, a lot of people go to the gym, a lot of people go running, a lot of people do weights, and it's very inconvenient and uncomfortable and kind of painful. But we do it because we know it's good for us, because we are investing in the long term, because you learn to take pleasure in difficulty, because you know it's worth it. And so I don't think people are that lazy. I think sometimes we are overwhelmed. We tend to focus on the urgent. Sometimes we forget about the important. And when somebody focuses and points out to you that this might be quite urgent, suddenly a different kind of pattern and availability of possibilities becomes salient.
Love that. And of course, one of the reasons that we're overwhelmed is precisely the technology that you're talking about, right? Is that there's an element of, I mean, there's that Steve Bannon quote about flooding the channels with shit, right? And it does feel like we're sort of drinking from a fire hose. And so to a certain extent, these things are helping to cause the very problem that leads us to turn to them. And you can make that same argument. I guess fast food would be a similar argument.
Yes, and there are so many other examples. It's also a pattern in abusive relationships. So the abuser tortures the victim and then consoles her. This is a typical thing. And with tech, we're seeing that tech is creating incredibly important problems, like how it's making teenagers feel and how it's affecting their social life, and then proposing more tech as a solution. Or, with dating apps, people are finding it harder and harder to meet people and more of an alienating experience. And now you have a co-pilot AI to help you navigate the app, as if that was the appropriate antidote.
Which is kind of funny until it's not, right? I mean, we laugh about it. And one of the things I've heard you say before, which I loved, was the idea that tyrants don't like comedy or joke because it unpicks what's there. So for me, laughing about this stuff is critically important and plays a significant role, but underpinning it is a serious thing. This has serious consequences.
And that is really important. Laughing is really important. Having this sense of lightness, that yes, this is a heavy topic, but you tackle it with lightness, with optimism of the will, with light. And when you go back again to history, if you imagine yourself in a king's court and there were all these important figures, who was the truth teller? Was it the astrologer? No, it was the jester of the court. That's the person who, if you really want to know what's going on, that's the person you listen to, because they were the only ones who had the permission to say the truth, because it was veiled under comedy and laughter. And one of the examples I give in the book about the kind of thing that we might be missing out and the kind of thing that we should learn from is Seinfeld. And of course, this is very revealing about myself. I'm a Seinfeld fan. No surprises there. And Seinfeld, when it came out as a pilot, did spectacularly badly. The focus groups all said that it was a weak show. Nobody wanted to see it. Nobody was excited about it because it was a kind of humor that hadn't been done before. Nobody had seen anything like that, and it was a kind of acquired taste. But there was one person, one executive in NBC who became a champion of the show. And what is fascinating about that example is that for a while, it wasn't that successful. It created a kind of niche group of followers, but it was quite limited. And then it went on to be one of the most successful shows in the history of TV. And not only that, I think it inaugurated a kind of observational humor that has now become very common. But if we were to go back to that moment and give the algorithm the task of lowering risk for NBC and choosing a successful show, it would have never chosen Seinfeld. And it's very funny to listen to Seinfeld and describe how they developed the show. And they would go to these meetings with NBC. So Seinfeld had never done a sitcom. Larry David, his co-author, had never done a sitcom. So they would go into these meetings with NBC executives who would tell them how to do a sitcom. And they would nod annoyed and then said, we're not going to do that. And Seinfeld goes as far as to say that you almost knew you were on the right track when the network told you no. We're missing out on that kind of creativity and disruption and thinking outside of the box when we're so hung up on predicting and using past data to project onto the future.
And that's a really good example of something, again, I wasn't expecting in the book. And you bring a lot of yourself in there. And you're very self-deprecating about your own experiences. And there are nice sort of comic flourishes in there. Was that a conscious choice when you started writing, or was that something that just seemed like a good thing to do as you were going through?
It was a very conscious choice, and it still makes me nervous because it's the first time I do it. In Privacy is Power, there was not even a
sentence. That's why I was going to ask, because it wasn't a thing I'd seen in your writing before.
Never before. And it came out of a few motivations. The first one is this is post-tenure, so I feel more freedom. I feel like it's my duty to use that freedom, because if I don't use it, then we're wasting our money as citizens by paying for academics. Right? If I'm going to just say what everybody else says in the same way, then what's my value here? Another thing that comes into play, I think, is just growing older and feeling that life slips away and it's so short. And if I don't say what I want to say now, when am I going to say it? What am I waiting for? It's also, I want to express what I think is the value of academia and writing and scholarship. And I think it's incredibly important for democracy. But I also want to be honest about it and critical and hopefully self-critical. And it has a lot of problems, obviously. And one of the ways in which you can be more transparent about it is trying to explain to the reader where you're coming from. And that is a limited view. Like, everybody has a limited view. And I didn't want to pretend that I have like a God's view or an objective view. There's no such thing. This is where I'm coming from. And you make what you will of it.
No, I absolutely, it was surprising, and not just surprising to you, but it was surprising in other books that because people might talk about their research, but you're talking about just anecdotes about stuff that's happened to you and experiences you've had. And you flagged this up very early on, right? This is sort of give you an insight into the experience of being an academic at Oxford. And so I loved it. And so part of me wanted to just encourage you to do more of that, because I just thought it was a lovely, and it didn't feel like it was an interlude from the story. You knitted it together. It was there for a reason. But it just sat there really nicely. And I thought that was one of the things that made what you did delightful and almost underpinned. We're talking here ultimately about technology and the risks that it poses, the inhumane stuff. And so for me, it was a lovely counterweight. Here's a human talking about human stuff, which points to some of the things that you come to at the end with how do we, I guess, fight the risks, fight the challenge that we've got here is to be more human. And so I guess part of this was you illustrating that you want to be human in your writing.
Yes, you try your best and sometimes you fail and you make all kinds of mistakes. There are all kinds of faults in it. But those faults are part of what it means to be human. They are like an artisan mug that is not perfect in shape, that has its chips and has its history. And it's part of appreciating real beauty, not fabricated with a generative AI model that might give you a very smooth and slick image. This is real life.
Talk a little bit about at the end. You took us to quite a dark place in the book, but in a nice way, right? It wasn't like, oh my God. And I thought, how's she gonna finish this? Because there's a potential ending to this book, which is, this is a nightmare, right? We need to do something about this right now. But you take us to a slightly different place, which is actually, here's some stuff that we can do. And obviously I want people to read the book, so let's not go through all the things because they need to read it for themselves. But just give us a sense of that positive. I mean, I'm assuming that's a deliberate view of, we need to find a positive. People need to have a sense of they can do something about this, because you could look at it and go, it's massively overwhelming. And you have this nice toolkit at the end.
Yeah, I wanted it to be a book that is, on the one hand, very philosophical. And in particular, if you're a philosopher, you can go in the rabbit hole of, rationalist versus empiricist. But I also wanted it to be a very practical book for any kind of citizen, but in particular, people who work in business and who deal with risk and who have to make real choices and who might be persuaded by the arguments, but then wonder, okay, but what does this mean in practice? Like, you're telling me that I shouldn't make predictions in these cases, so what do I do instead? It's a combination of things. It's partly a matter of changing your lens, and that's enough to guide you in the right way. For example, I emphasize preparation in contrast to prediction. And one example is, if you think about airplanes, they're really a kind of incredible artifact. They are the safest way we have to travel. And when a flight takes off, you don't have a team of engineers trying to predict whether a goose will impact the engine. That would be pretty inefficient and pretty scary.
Right.
And we would probably get it wrong. Rather, you build the airplane so that it can withstand that kind of impact, because you know that sooner or later it can happen. So that kind of mentality of, how do we build robust companies, robust institutions, knowing that we can't predict some very important things, but knowing that they're likely to come at some point. Another general advice is to increase serendipity in your life. One of the worst outcomes that we are having from using so many algorithms is that they are essentially deciding what we see, who we meet, who we talk with. And the more you can increase serendipity in your life, the more you open yourself up to the possibility that somebody might surprise you. And when you think about your own life, I don't know if this is true for you, but for me, some of the most important people I've met in very quirky, unexpected ways. And some of the key moments that have led me from one place to another have been very serendipitous. And if we lower that serendipity, then we are more in the tyranny of algorithms. So the general metaphorical gist of it is, just take strolls along the beach, because you never know what the tide will bring. And what that means, it means talk to strangers. It means read very widely. It means do something that you're not sure whether it's common for you or it's typical for you. It just means be open. And then maybe a third thing is to cherish the analog around us. We are dazzled by the digital. We think it's cutting edge, but often cutting edge means that you're the guinea pig. And the analog world is not only the tried and tested, but it's also the substrate for everything, including the digital. And when we neglect the analog, which involves the world of things, of coffee shops, of beautiful objects, the world of people, flesh and blood people who can give you a hug or go with you to the cinema, and the world of the ecology, the trees and animals and the natural world, when we neglect that, often it's not easy to recover them. We had a sense of this in the pandemic. If you stop going to your favorite coffee shop a year later, the coffee shop was gone. And the analog world is very good at grounding us because we're analog beings. And virtual water will never quench your thirst, not now nor in 1,000 years, no matter how good the virtual becomes, because it's not water. And to remember that we're analog beings. And that has implications for business, for how you think about employees and customers, to the kinds of resources that you prioritize and take care of, to how you build backups to make sure that you retain autonomy of your company, even if you're using AI for some tasks.
There's so much to unpack there, but as you were talking, I was thinking, it's really interesting the way tech kind of tries to fool us slightly. So if I looked at, you mentioned this in the book as well, if I looked at sort of how do I decide which restaurant to go to or coffee shop or whatever, well, Google Maps, very helpful, right? And it'll even give me ratings that people, so I could sort of fool myself and say, well, actually, I'm doing something really smart here, which is I'm not relying on the technology. I'm relying on other human beings because it's human beings that have rated this stuff. Of course, not recognizing that there's an algorithm that sits on top of that and decides and let's question whether human beings are behind all of it. But even if they were, it sort of fools me into thinking that I'm getting opinion, I'm crowdsourcing an opinion. That's got to be a good thing. But you're absolutely right. It's filtering that. And I think, LinkedIn's the one that frustrates the hell out of me because I really don't understand the algorithm and where stuff is going. But this idea of we're kind of fooled into it's getting very good at pretending to be the real world. And the bit that really struck me as I was reading and as I thought about my own dalliances with it is Gen AI. It's pretending to be human. And it's not, it's a con trick, right? It's a massive con trick that we're fooled into sort of recognizing it for something that it's not.
Yes, even more concerning is how it's shaping how we talk, how we view the world, how we act. So Kyle Chaika from The New Yorker has this example of how algorithms are changing coffee shops because something like Google Maps will prioritize a particular coffee shop and then it will become very popular in detriment of the others. The others start losing customers, they start worrying. They realize that this other coffee shop is more popular, and it's partly because the aesthetics of it goes well with an app like Google Maps or Instagram or whichever one you want to talk about. And so they copy the same aesthetics to bring in more customers. And suddenly we have the same coffee shop everywhere, whether you're in Madrid, in New York City, or in Oxford. And we're losing a lot of variety and a lot of style and a lot of different ways to interact. It's a bit like having a monoculture. That even if you thought that this particular seed was stronger than others, to only have one makes you very, very vulnerable and takes away a lot of the richness of culture.
When you talk, there's a real energy and passion and very, very human dynamic. And the thing that amazes me is, and this points to the solution that you've got, but I could see a world where someone like you, the insights that you have, and the conversations that you have point in a very negative direction, right? It'd be very easy for you to sit there and kind of be the well, let's use the term, right? Prophet of doom. And you're pointing in that you're in a way, you're not, the bit I love is you're not trying to predict where this is going, right? Because that would be ironic for the book, but you're pointing some stuff out that could leave us overwhelmed. You finished the book nicely, but I could see it must be, is it draining for you to look at all this stuff? Or because there's a real sense of positivity I get from you, but I could see that it could be quite overwhelming, and you can get to a stage where you go, oh man, because you're getting insight, you're seeing the iceberg in ways that perhaps I wouldn't be.
That's a very good question. And it goes back to how we started the conversation. I try to see what others are not seeing. And when I wrote Privacy is Power, others were being very optimistic about tech. And I saw a very bleak reality that I portrayed there. And even there, I saw ways out and possibilities out. But it's a much darker point of view because I felt like it was missing. Like most of what we had out there about the data economy was so positive, and we weren't seeing this gloomy scenario. Some years later, I now find that the public sphere is full of gloom and doom. I don't think that's realistic either. There are these rays of sunshine that we're completely neglecting. I see outside my window, and there are beautiful trees. I'm surrounded by people who are incredibly smart and virtuous and who are doing incredible things. I work in companies or with companies who are innovating in ways that astonish me every day. And now I think we're not seeing that. The capacity that we have to transform the future, and how often we dread difficult times. But when we are faced with them, we can rise up to the occasion. And you can find yourself making decisions and coming up with ideas that you never thought were possible and that wouldn't have happened had you not felt that pressure.
Love that. I'm going to ask a dangerous question now, which is to ask you to look ahead a little bit. So you've been on this, sounds like one of these TV talent shows. You've been on a journey, right, of looking at the privacy thing. You look at well, I'm going to ask it anyways. I recognize the stupidity of the question, but what's next for you? Where are your glasses? Clearly the book is coming out, right? So that's going to take your time to prepare that. But as one of the things I've realized, you write a book, you go to print, and of course you will have had to go to print some months ago, right? So in the meantime, other things have gone, the world doesn't stop. You keep going. Well, what's your current direction of travel, even if you don't want to make too much of a prediction?
So, as Rick from Casablanca would say, I never make plans that far ahead. But what I do know more and more is that I'm a writer and that there are books ahead.
I love this. So, and is that without wishing to go into, is it that's just a sense of there's more to be said, and is that on this topic, or can we? I mean, I'm guessing based on what you said before, there'll be a little bit more about you in these things. There's more of your story to be told.
Yes, there is, and one of the interesting aspects of growing older also is to realize how much work there is to do. And you might find that exhausting, like, oh my God, we have so much work to do. But it's also kind of exciting. There's so much to be said. There's so much to be written, to be transformed, to be created, to be renewed, to be reminded of. I see a lot of work ahead.
I love that, because if we think about, and there's certain famous people we can think of, but there are others as well, where sort of who know everything, right? Who've solved everything. We tend to know that those are there's not much going on there when people think they've solved everything. And so I think there's a childlike delight in the way that you talk about things, right? With a sort of childlike curiosity. Is that fair?
Yes. And I think curiosity leads you to feel more curiosity, because the more questions you ask, probably you get more questions in response. And so it's a kind of wonderful journey of discovery. And part of what I love about writing is that I usually start with a question. I don't know the answer to it myself. And that process of discovering it partly brings us back to some of the pitfalls of using technology to give you answers, because the joy and the pleasure and the value and the journey is in the discovery. And you don't want to miss out on that. Forget about virtue, forget about doing the right thing, forget about duty. Don't miss out on the pleasure of it.
Because that instant gratification of what the right answer might be misses, I guess, opportunities to get things wrong and to go down rabbit holes and to be inefficient, right?
Yes, and to live life as an adventure, that you are driving, that you are interacting with other people who are driving, and that there is incredible richness in getting lost and finding your own way.
And you've had a really interesting academic career, moved around. I presume travel plays a key part in what you do, seeing new things.
Yeah, I've changed a lot with regards to travel. So when I was in my 20s, I loved it. And I was lucky enough to be able to do a lot of it. I traveled to very exotic places and did very exotic things. And eventually, I started to tire of it. And I think I went more mind traveling. And a lot of the places I've been in as an academic has been following grants. And that has been interesting, because it has led me to places that I think I might have not gone to had I had a different criteria, had I made choices on the basis of what I thought about places or what I thought it would be like. And now I think I'm entering a different stage of life and how I view travel. But I think I'll have to report on that, because I'm just about to go on a very long trip, partly on book tour.
Right.
Because
your publisher's not going to let you get away with not trying for this. And actually, back to that point you were making there about grants, one of the things, again, you addressed in the book is the fact that actually, if you were to take the opposite view, if you were to be pro-tech, it would be easier to get grants, right? The wallets behind the tech companies mean they are unlikely to fund the sort of research you're doing. They're more likely to fund the pro-tech. And it strikes me that that's another example of, you could easily have taken your research and been swayed by that. Again, you'd have had an easier path. And I want to acknowledge that. But secondly, ask you about that. Surely on some level, it must be tempting as a human to sort of go, actually, there's an easier path here.
I think when the crucial moment came to make the decision, I made it. I think I made the right decision, and now it's too late.
Right.
Because one thing you said, that the business model of most tech companies is unbelievably toxic. You kind of burnt that bridge. And I would do it again. I would do it again, and I still do it. Because I think that's my job. And if I sell myself, I might have it easier in some ways, but I will have it a lot harder in others. One of the aspects that brings me more joy in my life is the freedom to think, the freedom to write whatever I want, that nobody is telling me what to think or what to write, and to lose that. There is a sense in which it truly doesn't have a price, that whatever price you might offer would not compensate.
And if tech companies were to approach you and say, we want to do this right, I presume based on the way that you pick, sure, new startups might have a different perspective and there may be alternative models. I presume the existing models, that would be a challenge for you to look at those things and go and work with those people. I mean, do you believe there's because you talk a lot about wealthy people and what drives them and those dynamics. And I thought, and I love the sort of, they claim to want to do good, but if they really wanted to do good, they wouldn't have as much money as they do argument that you make, which I think is very, very powerful. But is there a path back for some of these larger things, or is the solution to this, and I guess then also your participation to the extent you wanted to do it, does that require new models? I presume it's too late for these existing ones. You wouldn't want to have anything to do with them, given what you said. But also, it's kind of hard to turn those things around.
I don't know. I think there are different. The honest response is very nuanced. So if a company that I think is doing great harm were to offer to hire me, that has already happened. And if I get the sense that the job is to silence me or to greenwash them or ethics wash them, I will say no. If a company that I think is doing great harm invites me to give a talk, especially if it's private, about ethics, I would definitely say yes. Because I still have hope in humanity. And these companies are made up of human beings who can make different decisions, from designing things different to quitting or to becoming a whistleblower. And if I have a chance to say what I think should be said to those people, I will take it. I don't think that's problematic. And I am not banking on this. And I'm not predicting the future. But you do have examples of, for example, oil companies that are veering towards green energy. Why are they doing this? Are they doing this out of the goodness of their heart or because they're smart? I don't know. But they're doing it. So is it completely and absolutely unimaginable for a company with a business model that is toxic to change business model? No. Is it the most likely thing to happen? No. But something I very much enjoy is I'm part of the board of the Proton Foundation, which is a majority stockholder of Proton, the company. And I do it because I believe in it. And they were the first to come up with encrypted email, and now they have VPN and calendar, and they're growing the ecosystem. And I love that. I love to see companies innovating. And part of what we're saying when we criticize AI is this is a bad product. This is a really bad product. And a lot of people box me into the category of, oh, you only want regulation. And there are so many things that are imprecise about that picture. The first one is that they tend to think about regulation as something that the government imposes on companies against the wish of companies. But often regulation is something that the public asks the government to do on their behalf, and that improves conditions for everyone, including companies. Like, for example, safety with cars. Cars became much more popular and much safer and innovated in aerodynamics and materials because it turns out people don't like to get killed in cars.
Who'd have thought?
Who would have thought? So that's one part. But the other part is actually what I want to see most of all is innovation. I want an 18-year-old to look at the world today, to read my book and say, I'm going to do the new AI. And I'm going to do an AI that does not surveil and that is ecologically much more responsible. And I am not going to work for one of these companies, and I am not going to be anyone's slave. I'm going to do my own company. I'm going to try it out. That's what I want to see.
I love that. I think that, Carissa, is the perfect note on which to end this conversation. Before I let you go, I want you to remind people, let's do both of your books, but let's start with the new one so that we can get the orders in for that. But remind people of those two things and anything else you want to tell them.
Thank you. I have to actually look up the book because I don't know the subtitle. which I know
That's
sounds
that's
kind
why
of
I didn't read it
crazy.
out, because it's quite long. It's on point, but it's quite long.
It is. And, I confess in the book why this is the case, because subtitles are designed not for people, for algorithms, for the algorithm to make it show up. So, my new book is called Prophecy, Prediction, Power, and the Fight for the Future, From Ancient Oracles to AI.
Amazing. Available at proper bookshops, obviously, and of course, we want people to read it in physical form.
Yes, available anywhere where you find books. And the previous book is called Privacy is Power, and both of those are very complementary, because one is about the machinery of prediction and the other one is the machinery of surveillance that feed the prediction.
Amazing. The other thing people should do is follow you on LinkedIn, because I love your content. It's always interesting and engaging. You're a definite scroll stopper for all the right reasons. But as people have detected on the show, you just I'm so pleased that you are there. I'm so pleased that you're doing what you're doing. Your students, we were talking before we started recording about university experiences. Your students are incredibly lucky to have you, because I just think it would be amazing sitting in the same room with you, having these sorts of conversations with somebody that's really on a positive mission and incredibly curious. I love the fact that your chosen college in Oxford is the one that is closest to the library and closest to the main bookstore there as well, which is probably coincidence, but I think fits beautifully with the whole theme. But above all, Carissa, I just want to say thank you very much for everything you do. But above all, thank you for being an amazing guest on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to you for listening, and of course, to Carissa for appearing. To find out more about Carissa, her research, her books, and the topics we talked about in the show, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, where have you been? But thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. There are over 300 of them, so there's bound to be something there that I think you'll like. So there's bound to be something there for you. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review or rating for it on whichever platform you're listening to it on, please do so. It really, really does help. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe and remember there's only one thing that's certain about your future, which is that there will be another episode of the Human Risk Podcast, and you'll be able to listen to it wherever you found this one.